All right, I hit record as requested. We'll give just a moment to see make sure that we've got everyone here who's meant to be here. And then we will hand over to our speakers. All right, it feels like we are settling. We're doing pretty well on time, but I will be kind of timekeeping on our presentation. So our speakers, don't worry if you hear me jump in or put something in the chat, just because we want to make sure we get a good amount of time in the Q&A session. This is something that, for me, I lead the U.S. Embassy's engagement in the U.S. on the energy transitions campaign and all of the associated technological issues and social policy questions that come with it. So I'm really pleased to be here today with our distinguished speakers. So with that, I think I will hand it over to Dr. Haggett.
That's super. Thanks very much indeed, Cynthia. I'm just going to share my screen now. And hopefully you can all see that. So thank you. So hello, I'm really delighted to be part of this webinar today. I'm Claire Haggett. I'm speaking to you from Edinburgh today. It's a very dreich Edinburgh day. That's a good Scots word for you all. It means a bit me. So, but I'm really delighted to be here to be talking about clean energy, the road to a clean energy transition, moving away from coal power. And there are a number of really important aspects that we have to think about if we're thinking about a transition to clean energy. Of course, we need to have the technological solutions, and Brian will be talking shortly about some of the economic aspects. What I'm going to talk about today is that we need to think about people, and we need to think about the places in which clean energy technologies will be sited, and the communities that will be those technologies' new neighbours. And what I'm going to suggest is that we have to think about a fair and a just transition to clean energy, what energy justice scholars call a just transition. And that means ensuring that the costs and benefits of any transition to clean energy are fairly and evenly distributed. So my plan is basically for this talk, it's a talk in 3 parts. I'm going to talk about why people matter, why they behave in the way they do, and how we move forward. So that's the plan in 3 parts for today. I'm sorry if you can see my fingers moving at the bottom of the screen. I'm basically waving my jazz hands here. I'm very excited to be talking about this. So, first part, why do people matter? When clean energy faces such significant challenges, when we have to move forward quickly with a transition to clean energy, why do people matter? And I think there's a fairly clear reason, and academic research from around the world has found that there is apparent high public support for a transition to clean energy. And yet, there is protest against clean energy developments. Whenever a development is announced, there will invariably be protest against it. And that protest is very often well organized, vocal, vociferous, and what matters, the key point is that that opposition is effective. All over the world, public opposition, community protest is preventing clean energy developments from being built. What I think that means is that we can't just dismiss this or will it away or ignore it. I think we have to understand how and why communities are responding in the way in which they are to clean energy. And I think that there are lessons that can be learned. There are success stories that we can build on, and also some things that we can learn perhaps not to do. So, moving on, I think we can understand how communities respond in the way in which they do. And academic research has highlighted 4 areas that inform community perspectives. And I'm just going to briefly go through each of these 4 areas. The first thing that informs a community response to a clean energy development will be the location in which that development is planned. And very often those locations are very beautiful, rare, valuable land or seascapes. And then there are quite significant concerns that these new developments will will completely change the nature of that area, will change the character or the integrity or the way of life there, that these developments might dwarf in their size and scale the existing things that are there, that they'll change the broader infrastructure if there's new roads or new developments that come alongside this particular project. And this is because these areas very often are very special. They may be very remote and rural because that's where the best clean energy resource is. But they may have very special ways of life that go on in those particular places. So these may be places that are very rare, valuable and beautiful, perhaps on a national or even international scale. So these places, the places in which clean energy developments are sited, they matter. Secondly, there'll be something about the local context, the local social, historical, geographic, political context that influences community responses to any clean energy development. And what these things are may vary from location to location. It may not be the same things that matter, but there will be something. There'll be something about the particular place in which a development is planned that influences responses to it. So I have an example here from some of the research that we've been doing here in Scotland. We have some very beautiful landscapes here in Scotland. And what we found is that local people, they're not just selfish, uninformed idiots. They are very knowledgeable about their landscapes. And it's a very nuanced understanding because these landscapes are embodied with memory and meaning. They form a way of life. They have done for generations previously. They're composed of the events that have happened there. And current landscape assessment doesn't necessarily capture that sense of meaning and value. So, for example, this is a sort of a fairly standard looking map. This is a map of an area in the Scottish borders. And these are the sorts of characteristics that we might see on a map. But for people who live there, these are the sorts of things that matter. So this is the same map again, but just giving a sense of the life behind the landscape, some of the activities, some of the ways of life, some of the meanings that these sorts of places have. Moving on. Third reason why communities respond as they do to clean energy developments, it's to do with the disjuncture between the costs and benefits of energy developments. And this is what energy justice scholars call distributional justice, making sure that those costs and benefits are evenly distributed. So, for example, the proportional reduction in CO2 emissions for someone who lives near a wind farm may be a very small and intangible benefit compared to very immediate, tangible, demonstrable problems that they might now be experiencing. The fourth set of reasons that influences community perspectives is not just to do with whatever the project is, but to do with the way in which that project is planned, to do with the process through which a project is developed and delivered. And this is what energy justice scholars call procedural justice, making sure that there is fairness in the process for any clean energy transition. So people are very often not rejecting change as such, not rejecting a project as such, but rejecting the way in which that project is being developed. And very often it's opposition to the developer rather than the development, thinking that the developer doesn't know or doesn't care about this particular location. Stefan Damborg, writing in the Danish context, talks about a lack of communication being the perfect catalyst for creating opposition, not making opposition worse, creating opposition, turning supporters into opponents. And there are some interesting things to say about engagement and in a consultation with people. Is that real consultation? Is it meaningful? Is anything going to be done with the results of that consultation? Richard Hindmarsh in Australia talks about doublespeak. And what he means by that is going through the motions of talking to people, but actually not doing anything with what they say. And Catherine Gross writes really compellingly about fairness of process and outcomes. And Gross suggests that if the process is seen to be fair, if people believe that there are opportunities for them to engage, if they feel they've been listened to, if they feel that the decision-making processes for a transition to clean energy have been opened and transparent, then they are much more likely to support the outcome, or at the very least not oppose it, if they feel the process has been fair. So, where do we go from here? How do we move forward? How do we move towards a clean energy transition away from coal power and to the clean energy that we need? If, for example, people aren't all necessarily uneducated NIMBYs. I mean, some of them are. Some people are fairly annoying. I've been at public meetings where I've wanted to knock people's heads together, but most people are not parochial idiots. Most people have knowledge and they have concern about the environment. They want to do the right thing. And often they are in support of clean energy, but are turned against it. So, what can we learn from 2 decades of academic research from around the world about how we move forward? I think there are 5 lessons that we can learn. The first lesson is that if the location in which a development is planned, if the land or the seascape there is particularly valuable or precious, what we need to do is involve people to create something new, not to be taking something away. And perhaps this is an opportunity to really excite and engage and invigorate communities. Maybe we should be creating energy communities, proud hosts for these brilliant new technologies. If we learn and we know that the local social and economic political context matters, then what we need to do is to demonstrate a knowledge and an understanding and a concern for that local context, not just be seen as parachuting in from on high, from national companies or international policy being dumped on a local community. We need to demonstrate an understanding of that particular place and then capitalize on it. So in South Wales, there are a lot of communities that used to be dependent on coal mining. The mines have all closed now. And those communities, there are attempts being made there to create new clean energy communities. So capitalizing on the energy generating heritage of a particular area, for example. If we know that there is often a disjuncture between the costs and benefits of clean energy, then what we need to do is create local, direct, tangible, immediate benefits now for those communities. And again, they may vary between different communities. So we've been working with the Aberdeen offshore wind farm, and we've been developing a community benefit fund there. So it might be about funds for communities, it might be about supporting community groups, it might be about reinvigorating a supply chain, it might be about building an infrastructure. It could be lots of different things, but it's about tangible and immediate benefits that local communities can feel now. The fourth thing that we know, and the fourth thing that will help to move forward, is thinking about engagement. And we know that if people protest, then what we need to do is engage early, have open, ongoing engagement with people. And we need to identify proactively people who matter in that local community and identify and address potential concerns before they fully evolve. Most people support clean energy. That's a great base from which we could be starting. Finally, the fifth thing we know is that if people are against clean energy because they haven't had a chance to have their say, then we need to talk to them and we need to listen to them. And wherever possible, we need to take action. And it may not always be possible to change things, but if people feel they've been valued, if they feel there's a care and concern about their communities and their locations, then they're much more likely to support this move that we need towards clean energy. So, final slide from me. The things that we know, communities matter, they are important. Morally, we're talking about making changes to people's ways of life, but pragmatically as well. Communities are effectively protesting. We need to know why, we need to work with them. And there are a number of reasons that form community perspectives to clean energy. It's about the landscapes, seascapes in which they're planned, issues that are pertinent to that context, issues which are happening now, and the opportunities for discussion that are available. So if we're thinking about a transition to clean energy, we have to take account of those factors. A just transition means making sure that costs and benefits are equally distributed, and it means allowing people to express themselves in a way that matters and listening to them wherever possible. Because I'm an academic, of course, I've put the references up, but of course, none of you are interested in those, so I'll quickly move on and say it's been a pleasure to be able to talk to you all today. I've just put my email address here, so I'm, of course, delighted to take questions after Brian's spoken in the session that follows, but if anyone has any questions or anything they'd like to follow up afterwards, I'd be delighted to hear from you. So that's it from me for now. Thank you all very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Claire. You are bang on time, so well done. I didn't need to do any moderating there. I'll encourage everyone, as we're going to move over to Brian now for his presentation, and to switch over from the kind of community engagement side to more economic view. Really pleased to have both of these very important perspectives. I'll encourage everyone, as the presentations are going on, please feel free to put any questions that you have in the chat. And after the presentations are done, we'll move over to Q&A. And I'll kick off with any questions that we have there, and then allow the conversation to go from there. And with that, I will hand over to Brian.
Thank you, Cynthia. So you can see my screen and you can hear my voice. Is that right? Okay, great. And Claire, thanks so much for this wonderful discussion of the social dimensions to essentially the transition. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to backpedal a little bit and maybe take us, at least in the context of the United States, but I think a lot of lessons are also applicable to the UK, like how we get to this point where we're in a transition that generates the types of disruptions that need to be addressed that Claire spoke about. So about 15 minutes to explain the entire 21st century low carbon transition in the US electric power sector. So hold on to your hats. I will say that the focus is very much on the first 2 decades of the 21st century, because that's really when we've seen the type of disruption that we're talking about. So here we go. So what I've got here is some data on the power generation mix of the US electric power sector, essentially for the last 2 decades, starting in the year 2000 and on through 2018, but these paths are continuing all through to today. And so what we've seen is, if we look at the generation mix of electric power in the US, we see that in the year 2000, coal accounted for about 53% of all electric power generation in the United States. That has been cut in more than half by 2018, and now in 2020, it's down closer to almost 20%. At that same time, the generation mix provided by natural gas units has roughly doubled, from about 17% to about 35% of the total generation mix. And what we're seeing, and I'll have my next slide will provide a little bit more detail on this, and wind and solar as generation sources have really significantly gained ground over this period of time, particularly in the last decade. And what this has meant is that the carbon intensity of American electric power generation has dropped about 35%. So the combination of switching from coal to natural gas, and then from both of them to renewables, has led to substantial reduction in emissions in the US electric power sector over this period of time. So if we look at renewable shares of electricity generation, we'll see that back in 2005, so only 15 years ago, that wind and solar were trivial parts of the generation mix in the United States. 0.5% for wind and 1/100% for solar. And now 15 years later, wind accounts for almost 10%, well, it accounts for 9% of total electric power generation in the US, and solar is counting for just about 2%. So when you combine those sources with other renewable sources, which are mostly large-scale hydropower, you get essentially a doubling of renewable energy's contribution to the US energy mix in this 15-year period of time. So fairly dramatic, still has a ways to go given the plans that are put out there, but it's been fairly dramatic change in the last 15 years. So why has this happened? So the first thing I'm going to be talking about is the technology and markets have been big drivers, certainly of the first part of this transition of the last 15 years. So we'll start, and we're going to get to kind of the big feature in the next slide, but I do want to remind people, and that is the abundance of natural gas as a result of new drilling technologies. But it's important to know that even kind of before we found those breakthroughs in the drilling front, there were breakthroughs in the processing front. So the natural gas combined cycle plants really combine two types of turbine systems. One is a gas turbine that turns as a result of the combustion of natural gas and the heat that generates there. So that turns the turbine to generate electricity, but then also the excess heat is combined with water to create a steam turbine. And so essentially what you're doing is it's a more efficient way to generate electric power. And these breakthroughs came through about 20 years ago and really started to increase interest in generating power with natural gas. And then really kind of the big story in a lot of ways has been the role of unconventional drilling. And that's through hydraulic fracturing and horizontal drilling. And so hydraulic fracturing is essentially injecting sand, water, and chemicals deep below ground, and then essentially using the pressure and the chemical composition to fracture the substrate down there, which in the U.S. This is essentially in shale formations. So it's allowed drillers to access the gas and the oil in shale formations through this technology. Now, this technology actually has roots that are almost 160 years old right now. So I have a picture here of Lieutenant Colonel Edward Roberts, who was a veteran of the U.S. Civil War, so it was fought in the early 1860s. And he developed a patent in 1865 for an exploding torpedo, whose essentially the essential function there was to loosen shale rock for oil. So this has been something that people have been thinking about for a long period of time. But the real breakthrough in the 2000s was combining this technology with horizontal drilling. And so as we look at that figure on the left, we see that the drilling operation not only goes down, but it goes out. And it turns out that these seams, particularly natural gas seams, tend to be wider than they are taller. So being able to turn this into a horizontal direction meant this was much more accessible. So you were able to access the gas and you were able to access more of it. And this led to tremendous increase in the abundance of natural gas. And so if we look at the price profile of natural gas over the last 40 or 50 years or so, we see that in the United States, natural gas prices, you know, for a few decades were sort of flat. It's always a little bit spiky. These are quarterly price growth. So you always see a big spike in the winter in the US because a lot of gas is used for home heating. And so right around the turn of the century, we started to see a big increase in natural gas prices because the natural gas combined cycle technology hit and really created the demand for it in the electric power sector. And what happened is the fracking boom that deployed the horizontal drilling technology really hit about the middle of the first decade of this century and led to a massive increase in the amount of natural gas that was extracted. This then led to a substantial decline in natural gas prices, making it even cheaper, a decline in price that exists to this day. And remarkably, in 2017, the United States became a net exporter of natural gas for the first time in nearly 60 years. So here's a natural gas export terminal in Louisiana. And what's remarkable about this is the plans for the natural gas terminals were started around the turn of the century with the expectation that the US would need it to import liquefied natural gas. By the time these plans were built, they essentially just turned the valves in the other direction and said, we're going to be exporters of liquid natural gas. And indeed, that is what's happened. So there's now a global market for natural gas that didn't really exist until the last decade. Okay, so the next technological advance is the economies of scale in wind and solar generation. And so on the left side here, what we have is it's sort of like a picture of the evolution of man, right? So it's the evolution of the wind turbine and how much taller and more productive it has gotten from the very first windmills that we think of in Holland in the 19th century to modern structures. And those first windmills might have been 1 to 12 kilowatts. Today, modern structures are 10 megawatts or more, which is enough when they're running to run about 10,000 households in the United States. So pretty remarkable. And this has all happened as they've gotten larger, they've become more efficient and cheaper producing electricity. Similar types of scale economies have occurred in solar. So we see really large solar operations, utility scale solar operations in the United States that are able to economically deliver electricity to the grid. And so I put a chart here from Lazard, the investment house that does estimates of the cost of energy technologies, to show that over the last decade, the average cost per megawatt hour produced of wind power has declined 70% in the last decade, and solar power has decreased 90% in the last decade. So these are major drivers of the uptake of wind and solar in the United States. So another big reason, of course, is public policy driving this transition. So at the national level, there are targeted energy tax credits. And so we think of those in the case of both wind and solar have benefited tremendously from these tax credits. But before that, unconventional drilling operations that led to hydraulic fracturing actually also received targeted tax credits from the US Treasury. In addition, there's a long and storied R&D program, a research and development funding program from the US Department of Energy that led to advances in hydraulic fracturing and wind and solar and other renewable technologies. So that's at the federal level. At the state level, 29 US states and the District of Columbia have mandatory state renewable portfolio standards, which require a certain percentage of electricity generated in those jurisdictions to come from renewable sources. Another 6 states also have voluntary targets. And then there are 10 northeastern states in the United States that have carbon caps on electric power generation, and that's called the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. And so they have an emissions trading program there, as well as in California, which is linked with the Canadian province of Quebec, that operates very similar to the EU emissions trading scheme that you're familiar with in the UK. So these have all been policy drivers leading to the uptake of low carbon technologies in the United States. Another driver has been private procurement. So all of the big tech firms have major commitments to go carbon neutral on or before the middle of this century. So Apple and Google and Amazon and Microsoft and Target, big retail operation in the United States and throughout the world, all have made big targets, and these are actually counting in the double-digit gigawatts of capacity. So these are not trivial anymore, and they're driving technical change. Also, a big factor here has been national politics, and so we've had 3 different presidents in the 21st century in the United States. Without going into, and we may have a 4th one in a few weeks. Without going into the details of how all of these presidents have differed in their climate and energy policy, just trust me that they have, and that these differences have had an impact in terms of where the momentum has been in the United States in terms of climate and energy. So for instance, back in 2016, when Donald Trump was running for president of the United States, he came to Central Appalachia and areas of Pennsylvania and Ohio with the claim that he would bring coal jobs back to Central Appalachia. So there had been a long-term decline in coal jobs in Appalachia, first caused by mechanization, secondly caused by environmental regulations that shifted a lot of coal production from Appalachia in the central and northeastern United States to the western United States, where the coal that is mined there is lower sulfur content. But also some of these carbon policies are starting to lead to it. So there had been a decline, and President Trump said that he would come in and change all that. So here we are 3.5, 4 years later, and we see that there has not been an uptick in coal mining employment, and that it had hit an all-time low at the end of 2019. Now, if you look at this figure, you will see there has been a flattening out since 2017. But this was right before the pandemic, and I could show you another figure that shows that the pandemic led to another 30% reduction in job losses in the March to April time period, and most of those have not come back. So what limits the power of the President of the United States to save coal jobs? One of them is technology and markets, as I described. It's now cheaper to generate electricity with natural gas and renewables. But another is a more subtle concept, and that's the concept of federalism in the United States. And this is the relationship between the national government and the state governments in terms of the distribution of responsibilities. And in the case of energy and environment, this is what's called cooperative federalism. And so a lot of signals are sent at the federal level, but they are implemented at the state level. And this matters a lot. So as I alluded to earlier, for instance, the state renewable portfolio standards were a major driver of renewable energy uptake in the United States. That happens at the state level, not the federal level. So I'm going to conclude with this, the yin yang of federalism. And the first part of this is this. In a case, you can still get things done in energy and climate in the United States, even if you have a presidential administration that is not necessarily wanting to advance that agenda. And that is a situation that we've had in the last 4 years in the United States. But along with that, sorry, that's something that came up on my screen here. You also can't get quite as much done when you have an administration that does want to act, because 50 states all have a say in what happens within their borders. And those things matter in terms of turning the needle in the United States. So thank you. If you have any more questions about this work, it'll be reflected. My presentation reflects a paper that I wrote with my colleague Will Nyber, who I believe is also on this call, in the review of policy research, and feel free to reach out to me directly with any emails. And now I'll turn it back to you, Cynthia. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. And I don't know if others have gotten a message. Okay, I think we had a slight technical hiccup there, but I think we are back in the session. Well timed though, to coincide with the end of Brian's presentation. So I think we are all back. Go into, oh, excellent, we even retained our questions. All right, thank you very much, Brian. And again, two speakers who came in exactly on time. So I'm very impressed with your own internal timekeeping on that piece. With that, I'm going to move over towards the Q&A session. We have a few questions in the chat, and I will turn to those, and please feel free to continue adding questions there, or if you want to, put a hand up and ask directly, that's excellent as well. But I'll start with a question for both of our speakers, which is that you both spoke to kind of the role of government in approaching some of these issues and the role of things like the private sector. I wonder if maybe we could expand a bit more on, from each of your perspectives, where the bulk of that responsibility lies and the different roles that government versus, say, the private sector or the civil sector might play in advancing this clean energy revolution from your perspectives. And maybe we'll go to Claire first.
Sure, thanks very much, Cynthia. That's a really good question. And I think from my perspective, I'm sure Brian will have a lot more to say about this as well. But from my perspective, there has to be the appropriate context in place which government can set in terms of a push for clean energy and the importance of bringing communities along with that emphasis and that drive. And then, of course, the private sector has a key role in terms of how they proceed with developments. So making sure that it's recognized that communities matter and that the time and effort and money it absolutely costs to work with communities is seen as being time and money well spent. And invariably it is that even if it does cost time and money, if that avoids going to a public inquiry, or if that avoids delays or avoids a project not being permitted at all, then that's absolutely time and money well spent. So from my perspective, government sets the agenda and sets the context in which these things proceed, and the private sector have a role in terms of how they engage and how important they consider the communities with which they're developing to be.
Yeah, I would echo those comments to a large extent. What I would say is, you know, and as I mentioned in my presentation, in the U.S., the federal government has established a policy context both through subsidizing different types of energy technologies and also by doing research and R&D. And then the state governments have tremendous amount of power. But I didn't go to the next layer of description there, but and part of the federalism in the United States is that the siting of energy facilities is primarily a state activity. And so it becomes a federal activity whenever energy is transmitted across state lines in the United States, but it remains a state activity. So that's why these renewable portfolio standards, it turns out, are very expensive. With all that, are very extensive. With all that said, the energy sector in the United States is essentially, it's a private sector endeavor. Most of the electricity is generated by investor-owned utilities. There are some that are generated by municipally owned utilities of cities and towns, and by rural electric cooperatives that are kind of owned by the ratepayers. But by and large, the electricity sector is a private sector endeavor, and certainly the oil and gas industry and the transportation industry are all private endeavors. And while there has been some discussion in some corners about perhaps having the national government play a larger role in the electric power sector in order to speed up the transition to decarbonization, in my opinion, politically, that would face a tremendous amount of resistance.
That actually dovetails nicely to a question that we've had in the chat. And Sindhu, I wonder if you would just like to ask your question directly.
Sure. Yeah, I think you're kind of like touching upon like the idea behind my question. So I just finished reading Leah Stokes's book. I don't know if you've seen that like on like just like circulating the media. And the principle is that like the utilities are kind of like the primary opposition to like renewable energy policies on the state level, which like you said is kind of like what like drives like particular developments in like a location. So I guess my question is basically, do you agree? And if so, like what strategies do you suggest? Like if the cost of renewable or clean energies are comparable with some of the alternatives, how do we create the kind of like political space that like we move towards those energies and like keep like these other interests from, you know, using their, because I guess like a utility just kind of like is guaranteed the money. They're it's like part of like the way that they exist is that they make a profit. How do we ensure that we can deploy clean energy everywhere?
Well, I think so. I'm not sure. I mean, I'm familiar with Leah's work, and I know about the book. I haven't read it yet, but she's a remarkably productive and thoughtful thought leader in the space. So what I would say about this is that so the way that you turn this into a public interest into private action is to essentially establish incentives, whether it's a price on carbon or whether it's a set of targets for renewables that then have sort of market aspects to them, and so that it ends up being economically, it makes more sense economically when there's the incentives, both positive and negative. Positive incentives to invest in low carbon technology and negative incentives to emit carbon in the production of electricity. To do that, that can move very much in line with the profit motivation of private firms. You know, in the US, there's two different kinds of markets for electric power. One is as you described, whereas you have state regulators establishing the rates that utilities can charge through a rate case. And then most of the electricity, a little bit more than half of the electricity in the United States actually operates through competitive wholesale markets, where you have an independent system operator who conducts auctions every 5 to 15 minutes about how electricity is going to be provided by generators in the market. And so that is very much of a market endeavor, and the incentives there are going to be driven by the same kinds of incentives that you see with the rate regulated utilities. It's just they'll be incorporated into market rules for how you bid into those markets. So, you know, I don't know if the question is, are you asking whether I think this would operate more efficiently and effectively if the government essentially took over the electric power sector, or if you're just saying, how do you align electric power, private incentives with the public good? I sort of more answered the latter than the former, but if you wanted to follow up, that would be fine too.
The latter is kind of more what I was getting at. I don't really see like the path towards having the state take over the utilities, but the latter was kind of my question.
Mm-hmm.
And I saw Claire nodding along there with the idea of creating the right benefits. I don't know if you had anything you wanted to add.
Yes, absolutely. Thanks, Cynthia. And just nodding furiously along with everything that Brian was saying then. So it's a different context in the UK, and the energy companies that we have here have a range of different energy sources that they use. And of course, they're all very keen to emphasize their green credentials. But exactly as Brian has said, even though it's a different context, the role of incentives is absolutely key here as well. Absolutely.
Yeah, so one thing I'll add to this too, is in the last year or two, I think up to 15 states have declared carbon neutrality, essentially net zero carbon by either 2040 or 2050. And the utilities that have primary operating space in those states have also made declarations. And in a way, I'm more encouraged, if you will, by when the private companies say that they're going to do it, because a governor, I mean, it's one thing if the legislature says they're going to do it, but if a governor just says we're going to go net carbon zero by 2050 and the governor gets replaced in the next election, then that executive action at the state level doesn't have as much meaning as when companies actually start putting the infrastructure in place to generate renewables and distribute them throughout their territory.
No, really excellent points and excellent question. Thank you. We're getting a lot of questions on CCUS. I'm going to turn there very shortly, but I did want to ask a question. Claire, I'd, in my previous years before turning to COP26 as our priority, I might spend a fair amount of time working on the idea of building a hydraulic fracturing sector in the UK. And those early days of kind of trying to do that. And a lot of the questions there were around some of the things you brought up for clean energy transitions. So needing to engage communities, demonstrate the benefits, demonstrate the regulatory space, and have those conversations. So I wonder if I could ask, do you see any difference in how you approach a clean energy transition in how you kind of engage on these social dimensions versus something like that, a traditional energy infrastructure build out?
That's a really good question. Thanks, Cynthia. And yes and no is the answer, but I'm going to elaborate a bit on that. So yes, of course, in some ways there are things that are particular to the technology or the project that we're talking about. And actually this applies as well. This is going to seamlessly move into thinking about carbon capture and storage, because there are some things that are particular about the particular project. So people might be concerned about the noise that comes from a wind turbine, for example, or what will happen in what will carbon capture and storage mean for them nearby. So some things will be project specific, absolutely, but much of this is similar. It doesn't almost matter what the project is if there is open, ongoing, continual engagement, if people feel that they've been informed and that they know what's happening, if they feel that the people running the project can be trusted. So there are common themes that run through any sort of new development, any sort of new project, that are about engaging communities, that are about building trust, that are about understanding the particular communities in which one might be building. And that's the same for CCS as well. So that's something which has been happening here in Scotland. There's a lot of emphasis on that here in Scotland, and colleagues of mine have been looking at some of the sorts of community responses to thinking about CCS, and we find that people are concerned about what this technology might mean. They're concerned about the risks of it, they're concerned about the dangers of it, but a lot of it is very similar to thinking about particular renewables projects, that it's about communication and it's about trust. So a lot of those things are common throughout these different types of projects.
So maybe all that time we spent on that will be useful lessons learned as applied to a clean energy transition. Can I ask just a quick follow-up on that? Are there any particular ways, and we have a great question in the chat about how You know, a Scottish permitting system is notoriously top down and doesn't necessarily engage public engagement. Do you have any recommendations for if you were, you know, going to recommend to, you know, a national government, how do you go about incorporating those kind of community engagement elements to ensure that they're part of the process?
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're quite right that thinking about that really does matter. That the top down, that at the government level, there has to be the priority, the incentives in place, and then there has to be the space demarcated to talk to communities, to put time and invest time and money in communities. So that could be finding those particular stakeholders, finding those particular community councils, the people who work in those communities, and investing the time and effort in those communities, because it does pay dividends. So here in Scotland, there are a lot of remote rural communities. There's a lot of emphasis on trying to make those resilient communities, and community energy is one way of doing that, and that means enabling communities to generate their own energy. And this, of course, has multiple tangible benefits. It's clean energy. It means that communities are not dependent on the grid. It means that people become much more aware and engaged with energy issues. These things become present and real. And it means we can start to create clean energy consumers who are really well up to speed with what it means to have a clean energy transition. So I think you're absolutely right to be thinking about that. And it's really vital, but it can generate such benefits if we can bring people along with us and create these energy consumers that are positively thinking about a clean energy transition. Then that would be a fantastic thing.
I so appreciate your enthusiasm on the topic, and it does provide a great segue to raise the questions that we have in the chat around CCUS. Which I think becomes a central question to any conversation about energy transitions, and how you maintain the role that you might need for, you know, natural gas and some of those traditional energy sources throughout. So Brian, I wonder if I might turn to you and see if you can just ask your views on how do you incentivize, or what do you rather see as the role of CCUS technology in the future of an energy transition, and how do you incentivize us to get there?
Right. I mean, you know, if you were to put a fine point on it, really, the question could be, is there a future for fossil fuels in a low carbon energy economy? And, you know, we talked earlier, and Claire talked earlier in particular about sort of the notion of just transition, right? And so oil and gas jobs in the United States and oil and gas jobs in the United States are very high-paying jobs, right? And so, to the extent that they would be transitioned out, they would need to be kind of offset by job growth in renewables. Okay, so, but they're of a much different nature, right? So, jobs in extractive industries are there as long as the resources are there, and then they'll shift to other resources. In the renewable industry, everything is capital intensive. It's up front. So it's the build out stage, but then once it's built, you kind of move on. So the employment dynamics of that are quite a bit different. And so a question is, if the goal is to keep carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, and if a goal is also to, you know, support and ensure good paying jobs throughout the American economy, is there room for carbon capture and storage to allow both those things to be accomplished? Now, there's a lot of other things associated with fossil fuel extraction besides the emissions of CO2 in the atmosphere that are environmentally problematic. And so you need to address those types of issues as well. But there is, you know, there is an abundance of fossil. So one thing I'll say from a political standpoint, though, this has been one of the few areas that has come to bipartisan agreement in the United States in the last few years, and that there was a tax credit that was put in the U.S. tax code called 45Q that provides a tax incentive for carbon capture, utilization, and storage. And it was supported by people from Montana and Wyoming, which are the heart of Western coal country in the United States, and West Virginia and Kentucky, the heart of Eastern coal country, and the green groups as well. So, you know, I see that as progress. Do I think CCUS is the sole solution to what we have going along? probably not. But I think at this stage of the game, when we're only 20%, sorry, you have to add nuclear in there, but in the US, you're maybe 35+% carbon-free electricity generation, and with the goal to go to 100, I think it would be premature to wipe out too many options on the table. But I realize I might get smacked in the face for that from others here. So.
And that, I mean, you raised the, and thank you for that. CCUS is such an interesting question, and you're right. In the U.S., it is a really interesting perspective, the way that it has gained bipartisan support as a technological solution, and then also, I think you increasingly see it be associated with more conservative solutions, and so you're starting to see some more progressive parts of the party turn away from it as a potential option, which is an interesting, seeing the interplay of politics on technology and climate. I wanted to ask, because you raised a good point around the question of just transitions. How do you ensure that these transitions spread the economic benefits? How do you, and the UK has great examples of this in its, transition away from coal, both from mining a few decades ago and now for power, and then looking at the interesting roles for that, where you have more active mining communities in the US. And so I guess my first question is, just transitions is such a broad term that gets thrown around quite a bit, and I don't know that we have a great definition for it. So I would be really curious to hear, your definition of what a just transition is, and what we should prioritize in a just transition. And then any thoughts of how, from a political and government perspective, we try to go about ensuring a just transition. And Claire, maybe I'll start with you on that.
Super, thanks very much, Cynthia. So energy justice scholars think about a just transition involving three key things. So they talk about recognitional justice, and that means what it sounds like, making sure that all the different parties who might be affected by a transition to a clean energy future are identified. And that might be fairly complex. So it might be the people who are living near a solar farm, or it might be that these are people who are spread around the world. It might be people who are near factories that are producing new technologies, for example. So trying to take account of the full process of transitioning to clean energy. So where things are produced, where they're going to be sited, and who might be involved. The second part is distributional justice, and that means trying to recognize that some people will benefit from clean energy, but some communities will bear the costs, and trying to redress that balance. And then the third part is procedural justice. So this idea that process should be fair, decision making should be open and transparent and fair as possible. And in terms of how to move forward for that, I've got a couple of examples from some of the things that the Scottish Government are doing. So, and it was a really interesting point in the chat about some of the policies that the Scottish Government have about community benefits. So the Scottish Government have guidance which all developers adhere to about the amount of money that has to go into a local community if they live near a wind farm, for example. So that's £5,000 to a local community per megawatt of energy generated. And there are, of course, conversations to have about whether that is fair, and then, of course, how that money gets distributed. And a lot of community tensions come to the fore when there's cash floating about, as can be imagined. But there is a set amount of money that is transferred to communities. And I think the Scottish Government is the only one in the world that has policy for offshore renewables. So there's not a set figure on it, but all developers who want to develop offshore renewables in Scottish waters have to demonstrate benefits for local communities, that they are engaging with local communities and that they're going to provide benefits for local communities. And there is now new policy in place to identify those communities, because of course that's not necessarily straightforward onshore, it's even less straightforward offshore. So, and I feel like I sound like I'm advocating for the Scottish Government now. I'm an entirely neutral academic, but there are some interesting things going on here about trying to take some of these principles and trying to translate them into policies that ensure that developers are talking to people and that they are trying to provide some kind of benefits for local communities. And I can certainly, I'm sorry, I'm doing international sign language of typing now, but I can certainly put some links to some of those policies in the chat if that's helpful as well.
Yeah, that'd be great. Thank you. I think, Brian, I appreciate some question to you from kind of the more economic perspective on the, the idea of just transitions.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think Claire nailed it with that three-part taxonomy. I mean, I guess what I would say, it is important to remember the part about the distributional effects on, and Claire didn't specifically pinpoint this, but one way it becomes unjust is if certain people's, say, the price of energy goes up dramatically in a fairly short period of time in order to kind of pay for the transition. And even though in my presentation, I sort of focused on the fact that the cost is actually at parity, and so maybe there shouldn't be an awful lot of disruption that brings higher costs. Reality is, even like building transmission infrastructure, so you can actually have the cost of generation go down and the retail delivery of electricity go up, because you have to have a lot of investment in transmission infrastructure to bring that in. So I think it's important. I think it's important to remember that. If I could, I did want to jump on one thing in the chat group. There was a question that was directed to me on the use of hydrofracturing as an economic driver that's in the U.S., saying the environmental impacts of of this are substantial. How do you envision U.S. gradually moving away from this, if at all, while not compromising economic growth? And so I think, part of it is there will be a lot, if the commitments are there to decarbonize by mid-century, as described, that will have to be a significant driving force. CCUS issue that we just talked about, pack that in there as well. I won't revisit those issues, but that could mean in the energy sector, there could still be use for natural gas for some period of time. But the other thing to remember is at least in the US, more than a third of the natural gas is not used for energy, but it is actually used in industrial applications. And those don't always lead, I mean, there's methane issues, but they don't necessarily lead to, they're used in petrochemicals, say. And so they'll continue that extraction, I would imagine, will continue for some period of time. And so the environmental issues associated with hydraulic fracturing, I think you're alluding to probably methane getting in aquifers more so than the chemicals. They're going to have to be addressed probably primarily by state and local governments.
And we have a very helpful countdown in the corner to keep us on time, where they're going to kick us out of this room. So in just the last 4 minutes, I did want to give each of our speakers the opportunity, if there's anything that we didn't cover, any final points, maybe looking to the future, that you might want to be sure you got the chance to share before we ended for the day. All right.
I'll just pop in. It's about COP26, right? And so I think we've had an interesting perspective from the UK and the US. And I alluded to this in my what we know and what we don't know situation, but clearly this, by being technological and market leaders, UK, US, Western Europe, Japan can really kind of lead the way in the technologies, but unless they're adopted and uptake in developing countries that are increasing their amount of energy use emissions, then it'll be a problem, right? And so, especially as more and more people come onto the grid, the electric grid, for instance, to have access to electricity for the first time, that's a justice issue. We have to make sure that it happens. We have to make sure it's done in an environmentally acceptable way that won't disrupt the climate system.
Thank you. Claire, any last words?
Well, as much as we can reduce emissions across all sectors, there are still going to be some greenhouse gas emissions in the system by 2050, and those are shown in this pink line. These are things like we could still have some emissions in aviation, in heavy industry, and the non-CO2 greenhouse gases that come from agriculture. We can get them down a bit, but we can't get them down to zero. That's just a function of biology and of growing our food. So what we need to offset these remaining emissions that are in the system, after we've done everything we can through immediate and aggressive mitigation across all sectors, is we can create some negative emissions. And we do that by, one of the methods that we can do that by the nature-based solutions. So this is using plants to suck up CO2 from the atmosphere through photosynthesis, and we then store that carbon in plants in a sort of medium to long-term carbon storage. And that gives us the negative emissions we need to mop up those remaining positive emissions in the other sectors. We can characterize the greenhouse gas removal options in a number of ways, but this is one way of doing it. We can, if we look over on the left, these are the natural solutions. So we've got things like afforestation, reforestation. We've got the restoration of peatlands and wetlands. We've got biochar. We've got soil carbon sequestration. So these are the nature-based solutions that I'm going to focus on today. The ones that I'm not going to focus on are over on the right. So there are some options, for example, direct air capture, accelerated weathering of minerals, and these have some component of industrial or technological inputs. Just in the middle is shown one that's a combined nature-based solution and technology solution. So that's bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. You have bioenergy, which is a natural system. We grow bioenergy on the land, but then we capture that carbon and we pump it down underground into geological storage. So that's a sort of a combined one. But the ones I'm going to focus on today are these nature-based solutions over here on the left. They tend to be less costly. They're closer to deployment. We know how to plant trees. We know how to do that for thousands of years. But they're the most vulnerable to reversal. So we've seen an example in the California wildfires where we've seen large area of forest wiped out. Some of those were forests that were gaining carbon credits, and those carbon credits have now literally gone up in smoke. So there's some issues of reversibility there. The main thing about nature-based solutions is that they help also to co-deliver to biodiversity. So they are predominantly by the rest, they work through the restoration, the management, the protection and the creation of natural systems. So they can be characterized into those that protect existing high carbon ecosystems. So that's protecting the forests, stopping deforestation, stopping the drainage of tropical wetlands, for example. Restoration, where they have been damaged and degraded, we can restore them to their original function by better management. For example, that includes re-wetting of peatlands to allow them to get back into a state where they're gaining carbon again. Management of existing systems, so we have a lot of managed land. Over 50% of our land is in use for agriculture. We can do more in that land area. 50% of the ice-free land is managed for agriculture, and we can improve agricultural management to increase carbon sinks, for example, through carbon sequestration. And then we have the creation of new ecosystems. So that, for example, is afforestation, planting trees in areas where there weren't previously trees, or in degraded lands, for example. But all of these involve working with nature, with people working with nature, and we imagine that we will get, as well as greenhouse gas reduction, some of these other co-benefits, flood and erosion control, cooling, water and food security, sustainable livelihoods and cultural values. So the a number of nature-based solutions that we've been looking at in the UK as an example, fitting in under these broad categories of protection. We can protect existing forests, permanent grasslands, peatlands and wetlands, for example. We can restore the degraded dune systems, degraded forests and degraded peatlands. There's quite a significant mitigation potential there. We can better manage our croplands and pasture lands and the existing managed forest area to increase the amount of carbon that's stored in them. And we can create new high carbon dense ecosystems, for example, new forests and terrestrial woodlands, and things like agroforestry and hedges to go in between fields, which were largely grubbed up due to industrialization. There's a significant global potential, as I've already said. This paper by Bronson, Griscom et al. Looked at natural climate solutions, which is a form of nature-based solution, and looked at them in terms of the habitats or the ecosystems that we use. So we've got forests over here, a really significant potential from reforestation, avoided forest conversion, forest management, improved plantations, etc., etc. A number of possibilities in grasslands, again, smaller per area mitigation potential, but it occupies a really wide area of the globe. So there are lots of hectares to play with there for increasing soil carbon in particular. And the restoration of coastal and inland peatlands and wetlands, and also to avoid the further degradation. All this adds up to about 30% of the target that we need to get to hit our 2-degree target. So we can have up to 30% contribution from natural climate solutions from these nature-based solutions if we do them right. When we look at the nature-based solutions, we find that a number of them have advantages and some disadvantages compared to some of the technology solutions. So this is afforestation at the top. The green dot means that it's good, the red dot means that it's bad. So we're looking at afforestation as a good cost, low cost, low amount of energy, but there's a significant impact here on land and water. So when you plant trees, you increase the land and water use. If we look at soil carbon sequestration, it's pretty good across the board. So it's good for energy, land, water, as well as reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and it's low cost. If we compare that with bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, just an example, we can see that bioenergy with carbon capture and storage at the levels that we'd need them have a really large land footprint and a particularly large water footprint. And it's also quite expensive. At least the CCS component of it is quite expensive. But as you can see, the nature-based solutions at the top tend to have a favourable traffic light. They tend to have green across the board, and we can use them to sequester carbon and to also address biodiversity. So just going into a little bit more detail, this is a horrible figure, but I'd like to just talk you through it. I think it's worth it. In the middle, we've got an option, which is afforestation, reforestation. That has a number of functions associated with it. So afforestation and reforestation can add carbon sequestration, it can produce food, fuels and other fibre, regulates water services, it's habitat for biodiversity, creates jobs and recreation. These are the functions that reforestation has. What we can do is we can map those functions onto the ecosystem services or nature's contributions to people. So these functions are shown to have these impacts on these ecosystem services. If you look at the middle ring of the pizza, these are the functions 1 through to 6, which contribute to these different ecosystem services. And when we know the impact on ecosystem services, we can look at the impact of the ecosystem services on the Sustainable Development Goals. So we've got the 17 Sustainable Development Goals shown in the outside ring of the pizza, and this is the contribution that's made by the different ecosystem services to these Sustainable Development Goals. We see there's mostly positive impacts. So for afforestation, reforestation, there are mostly positive impacts. We got variable impacts for zero hunger, for example, because forest land competes with land that we use for growing crops. And they could have some negative impacts, for example, on economic growth, local negative impacts, where we reduce deforestation, and that's an opportunity cost for people to make money from that land. So it's not all positive. There are some positives and some negatives, but the majority of the impacts on ecosystem services and the Sustainable Development Goals are positive. For soil carbon sequestration, we go through the same process. We look at the functions, the contributions to ecosystem services and the contributions to Sustainable Development Goals, and we find entirely positive entirely positive impacts on all of the ecosystem services and all the Sustainable Development Goals. So soil carbon sequestration looks like a nature-based solution that we can use in a no regrets way, in that we're unlikely to have any adverse impacts. And the last example I'll show, just as a way of contrast, is large-scale bioenergy with carbon capture and storage provides energy and carbon sequestration, and you can see that there are some negative impacts potentially on the ecosystem services, and potentially some negative impacts on the Sustainable Development Goals. So some positive impacts, but negative impacts, particularly when implemented at scale, and particularly when we look at the impacts on biodiversity and other ecosystem services. So nature-based solutions aren't one thing. There's lots of different ways that they're implemented and lots of different ways that they play out through the ecosystem services on the Sustainable Development Goals. We can look at it in another way, and this is just looking at the, again, it's a different way of showing the same sort of data. The blue, the darker the blue, the more positive the impact. Where we've got a pink colour, it's a negative impact, and the darker that pink colour towards red, the more negative impacts you get. So if we look at the ecosystem services here, you can see that a number of the nature-based solutions are broadly positive, or almost entirely positive, but we have some here, so for example, large-scale bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, or large-scale afforestation can give us some negative results. And it's a similar picture, slightly more varied, but we see a similar picture for the Sustainable Development Goals. So we have to do more work in quantifying this better. You can see a lot of gaps there in this table, and we need to do a lot of gaps to fill in those context-specific interactions between the actions that we do for nature-based solutions and the Sustainable Development Goals. So we'll just finish up with a summary. Nature-based solutions have a significant role to play in helping the world to achieve the Paris goals. Some nature-based solutions have a range of co-benefits, but a few present some trade-offs, and those need to be managed. Doesn't mean we can't do them, but it means we need to find the right way of doing them in that specific context. Implementation matters. There are really bad ways of doing nature-based solutions and good ways of doing it. For example, in the UK, if we plant broadly forests using native species, that's largely good for biodiversity. If we plant a whole bunch of monoculture production forestry, that tends not to be so good for biodiversity. So even within the same nature-based solution of afforestation or reforestation, there are good and bad ways to do it. There are trade-offs between some nature-based solutions and mitigation. For example, the widespread growth of monoculture crops for BECCS, for biofuel, that restricts the amount of land that can be used for nature-based solutions. So if we do a lot of one nature-based solution, that means that a lot of one technology, that means that we've got, that limits the amount of land that we can do nature-based solutions on. And the other thing that's important is to note that nature-based solutions do not reduce the need for immediate and aggressive emission reduction across all sectors of the economy. These are complementary, and they shouldn't be used to compensate for emissions that cannot be reduced. And you see some dialogue going on between, for example, the aviation industry, which wants to offset its emissions by using nature-based solutions. Heavy industry, just about all sectors are wanting to use nature-based solutions, and there's just not enough land to do that. The lands can probably just about get to net neutral, but it can't offset all of the emissions of all the other sectors. We really need to have aggressive emission reduction. That point I've just made about there's not enough land to offset all of the emissions from other sectors, we have to just think of it as something that we add additionally, and just to mop up the very, very, very difficult emissions, and they can't be used as an excuse to do nothing in other sectors. And there is some other examples about, for example, consuming less meat and dairy and reducing food waste. That frees up a huge amount of land that we could use for more widespread nature-based solutions. So we shouldn't think about nature-based solutions in isolation of the food system and in isolation of how we manage demand. We have to think of it in an integrated way, and we have to plan it with changes in the food system in mind, because changes in the food system allow us to make, it creates the headspace to allow us to do more nature-based solutions on the land that is freed up. So thank you for your attention. I'll leave it there.
Thanks so much. Definitely a lot that I think we're going to be coming back to in the Q&A. But for now, if we can move on, Diego, are you able to set and present?
Yes, thank you so much. I will share my screen now. Do you guys see my screen? Yes. Okay, well, as Professor Smith very well presented the case for nature-based solutions, I will show an example of how we as a technology startup are trying to bring innovation to unlock the full potential of the first part of nature-based solutions, which is reforestation, afforestation, and avoided deforestation. So as Professor Smith explained, there is an enormous potential for carbon capture, which is needed if we are to achieve the temperature goals that we have set. And we have a lot of land available to do it. As Professor Smith explained, forest, I always like to make the case that it's not just carbon sinks. You know, if we fall into the maximization of carbon sequestration, we might end up in a planet with a lot of eucalyptus trees and no diverse ecosystem. So biodiversity is an incredibly important thing to consider. Forests are the home of indigenous communities all over the world and supports the livelihood of lots of communities, provide water conservation services to many places. And as you guys may know, the Amazon rainforest produces its own flying rivers, which fertilizes all the surrounding areas. And if we lose more than 25% of the Amazon rainforest, we will be losing those water flows through the air. These flying rivers bring more water than the Amazon river itself. This is why, you know, we decided to focus on forest. And in the other hand, we saw how all these corporations were pledging to become carbon neutral, to achieve net zero, as well as governments that signed the Paris Agreement. And yet there was a gap between all those commitments and easy ways to send the funding in a way that would have high integrity. And by high integrity, I mean that the claims would be correct. That if a company claims that they are removing a ton of carbon and compensating emissions, that carbon is effectively removed from the atmosphere for mid to long term. And that means that we need to be able to measure, right? So we started our organization with the mission of restoring nature to solve climate change, unlocking the full potential of carbon markets to drive capital, harnessing the latest technologies for selection, validation, monitoring, and exchange. So there are two parts of what we're building. In one side, we are building a set of tools, technology tools to verify and monitor reliably, combining machine learning, satellite, drone, and LiDAR data. And in the other side, an online marketplace that can connect the parties with that data in the middle. So there are three main models that we have been building. A historical model that looks at data since 1984, looking for changes on biomass on forest. And with that, we can determine what is the baseline of business as usual on a given region, right? So in areas where there's a lot of pressure for deforestation, we can see the patterns of deforestation, and we can then use that model to predict how that deforestation can continue to spread in the future if nothing's done. We also built a verification model. This is our more precise model in which we try to determine with a high degree of precision how much carbon is there today on a forest. For that model, we combine high-resolution satellite images with LiDAR data collected generally by airplanes. And we use this new artificial intelligence technique called deep learning to then train those models. And we use ground truth that comes from forest services around the world, field plot data collected by foresters on the field, measuring trees one by one. We use that to train the models and to calibrate the models. And then finally, we built a monitoring model in which our objective is to be able to detect changes on the canopy cover in almost real time, establishing a form of disturbance alert system in which illegal deforestation or undesirable activities are detected early and they can be acted upon. So to go a little bit more specific on how we train these models, I was saying we contact universities, governments, and other institutions that have been collecting field plot carbon measurements in which foresters take a piece of land, they measure tree by tree, they write down the species, and then using allometric equations, they do a very precise estimation of how much carbon is there on a forest. We also collect LiDAR scans. Generally, there are airplanes, and increasingly there is a possibility of scanning with drones. These three-dimensional clouds of points that gives you a high precision measurement of the height of the forest, the volume of the forest indeed, and the structure of the forest. And then we combine that with hyperspectral imagery coming from satellite providers, and we can come out with these carbon stocks maps. And we demonstrated that when we have all this data, we can have less than 2% error with 95% confidence on our predictions. So this is quite a development that can unlock a lot of trust on being able to remotely assess the carbon sequestration in forest. And we use all these tools to try to replicate all the key aspects of a protocol for carbon credits, right? So for example, this is a project that is stopping deforestation in the Amazon rainforest. And here's a time lapse we put together of how deforestation is being expanded for agricultural development on the south and the east. And this project has effectively stopped deforestation. These charts on the left show how, for example, the one in the top, biomass has been going down on the region. This project has been able to keep the biomass up there. And this is the avoided emissions from not transforming this tropical forest into agricultural land. And this is a reforestation project in Uruguay that we analyzed, in which you can clearly see how biomass is going up. This is a carbon that is being sequestered at a really rapid rate. So with that, we are identifying outstanding projects that are happening already around the world, avoided deforestation and afforestation projects around the world. And we're producing these very deep reports. And there are so many reforestation, afforestation projects that we have helped start recently, in which you can already see the results, even in a short period of time. You can start see the greening from satellite images. So and we're bringing all that to online. We hope to start opening up our data platform more and more, so that more people can come and do analysis. There's the possibility of studying biodiversity on this ecosystem. That's not something we focus yet, but really my final point is that remote sensing and machine learning open up a lot of possibilities of bringing the trust, the transparency that is needed, so that we can create these thousands of forests that we need to remove carbon from the atmosphere. I'll stop there. Thank you a lot.
Thanks so much, Diego. Just to flag, and I hope everyone saw this in the chat function, but due to some technical limitations, we're going to have to exit this room only to re-enter it. So we have about 2 minutes remaining before we have to do that. But in the interest of sort of using our time wisely, I'll try to pick one up that we can maybe cover off, hopefully relatively quickly. Sort of a rapid fire question. maybe to each of you, and if we get cut off, feel free to take the time to think about your answer, and we can come back to it. But are the challenges or gaps you sort of see in this space primarily technical? Are they to do with project design and implementation? Or are we at a point where the real challenge lies in policy development and market frameworks?
I'll take that one first, shall I? Yeah, I think we know how to plant trees. It's not rocket science. So what's really lacking is a way of getting that finance into the projects in a verifiable way. How can we assure investors that it's a long-term carbon store, that it's safe, and that it's not going to be reversed? So I think those quantification methods, the sort that Diego was talking about, it's fantastic work. I think that will go a long way to helping us on the technical side. But I think there are still some steps to take. They're not insurmountable challenges, but there are some steps to take on the policy and finance side.
Yeah, I would agree with that, Professor Smith. And I would say that in the past there were questions around, early attempts at large-scale forest conservation projects. You might be familiar with the RED Plus projects, and there were questions around the success of these projects or some challenges that this project had in the past. And I think that we need to harness all these technologies, all this data, to make sure that we design projects that will succeed and we can monitor. So I think that all these technological developments can open up new doors. And then, of course, yes, we need more policy that incentivizes players to invest on this.
Great, perfectly timed. All right, well, hopefully we'll be joining this room shortly, but just again, a second thanks to all of you for great questions, and particularly to our presenters.